Hello and welcome to this video of the Environmental Sciences course of IEI High School. Este es el segundo video de una serie de videos donde trataremos aspectos importantes sobre el medio ambiente. En el primer video estudiamos brevemente el calentamiento global y vimos las causas hablando de los gases de efecto invernadero, así como las principales consecuencias y por qué debería importarnos el calentamiento global. Hoy continuamos con un aspecto muy importante del calentamiento global y este es el papel que juegan los océanos y el impacto del calentamiento global sobre ellos. In this video, we continue discussing the importance of global warming. We follow up our first video by talking about the role of oceans in regulating the Earth's climate and how these water masses are being strongly impacted by the concentration of greenhouse gases. We will follow up our first video by answering 4 questions. Number 1, what do we know about our oceans? Number 2, what role do oceans play in regulating the Earth's climate? The third question is, how is global warming impacting our oceans? And we will finish our presentation by discussing the fourth question. What are the consequences living species are facing? So let's begin by answering the first question. What do we know about our oceans? As of now, we should know that oceans cover 71% of the Earth's surface and they concentrate about 96% of all water on Earth. There are 5 major oceans: the Atlantic, Indian, Pacific, which is the largest one, the Arctic, and the Southern, the seas that go around Antarctica, as well as other water masses such as the Mediterranean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. Many scientists believe that the vast majority of the oceans, at least 80%, has not been explored yet. However, we know many interesting facts and information about our oceans. For example, although we still have to do more research, there are 2 points under the oceans known as the deepest: the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean and the Philippine Trench. Another piece of information that we're more familiar with is sea life. Scientists believe that there are still thousands of ocean species to be discovered, but they already know around 225,000, among which are tiny organisms such as algae, as well as the largest living animal on Earth, the blue whale. But why are we talking about oceans in regards to global warming? As we will discuss in a minute, oceans play a major and vital role in regulating the Earth's climate. So let's follow this presentation by answering the second question. What role do oceans play in regulating the Earth's climate? Okay, so since 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by oceans, it is understandable that they play a major role in regulating the Earth's climate. But how? Actually, the ocean and the world's climate are strongly connected. The way that oceans regulate the Earth's climate is by working as a heat and carbon temporary storage. They absorb solar radiation and carbon dioxide. Approximately 83% of the carbon cycle is stored in these waters. Later, this stored heat is slowly released back into the atmosphere and is later distributed around the globe. Oceans store heat and carbon dioxide and have a great capacity to do so. They also transport and exchange this heat and carbon dioxide with the atmosphere, creating a continuous exchange that works as a cycle. This cycle and continuous exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere creates weather patterns, determining the clouds that release water on land in the form of rain, as well as regulating the temperature by moderating it during winters and summers. And not only the oceans have water masses, but also the living species such as animals and their habitats, play an incredible role in absorbing the solar radiation and carbon dioxide. We can understand now the importance and major role that oceans play in the Earth's climate. However, these oceans that have such a vital influence and impact on the weather, temperature, and living species' quality of life are being extremely affected by global warming, since the exchange and interaction between the atmosphere and the oceans is intensifying. So let's answer now question number 3. How is global warming impacting our oceans? In our first video, we talked about greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect. We also discussed how the Industrial Revolution marked the beginning of the consumption increase of carbon dioxide in the shift to industrialized societies, and how the burn of fossil fuels, organic waste, and land use have exponentially increased the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. As explained earlier, oceans absorb around 83% of the carbon cycle. If the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have increased more than 35% since the Industrial Revolution, it is logical to say that the amount of CO2 absorbed by the oceans has also increased. If greenhouse gases that trap heat are increasing, this is translating to oceans and their living species absorbing more carbon dioxide and more heat, which obviously increases the temperature of the oceans. During Earth's history, the oceans have regulated the temperature and weather following the absorption of CO2 and solar radiation. Before the Industrial Revolution, the amounts of these gases released into the atmosphere and absorbed by the oceans were part of a working cycle that has created stable weather patterns and temperatures because they would be released at a slower pace that allowed oceans the time to absorb these gases, transport them, and release them back into the atmosphere. However, because of the large use of CO2 in human activities since the Industrial Revolution, we are releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at a faster rate than ever before, forcing the oceans to absorb larger quantities without respecting the time the oceans need to filter them, transport them, and exchange them back into the atmosphere, which is intensifying the exchange between oceans and atmosphere, and which translate into weather patterns that are not as stable as before. Now we have explained how global warming is affecting the oceans, but what are the consequences that living species are facing? Well, this increase of heat that oceans are absorbing has extreme consequences. First, the chemistry of the oceans is changing. The increased release of CO2 into the atmosphere and its absorption by the oceans is making them more acidic, which strongly affects living organisms, from preventing some species from building up their shells up to their reproduction and growth. A clear example of how impactful is CO2 over the marine species are the dying coral reefs, which can no longer survive the acidic levels and can no longer provide habitats for other species, contributing at the same time to a healthy environment. This picture is an example of a bleached coral reef. Number 2, closely related to the first point is the migration of some species. The ocean's temperature is increasing, which translates to the modification of water currents, and also because the melting ice from the North and South Pole is releasing more fresh water into the oceans, which strongly affects the water currents. This affects the migration of some species that travel looking for cooler waters, forcing them to travel further, and also the death of others that can no longer thrive in higher temperatures, which imposes big changes in the geographical distribution of marine species. And number 3, the increased temperature is melting ice, causing the rise of sea levels. The sea levels rise coincides with extreme effects on coastal habitats. It also creates more dangerous hurricanes, more powerful and more frequent storms, and other weather phenomena, as well as floodings, which forces people to migrate and means the loss of habitats and species that inhabit these. But before we continue any further, acabamos de ver el impacto que tiene el calentamiento global en los océanos. Ahora ya sabemos el papel tan importante que juega el océano en la regulación del clima de la Tierra y cómo contribuye el océano a crear fenómenos meteorológicos estables junto con la atmósfera, porque hay un ciclo de intercambio entre radiación solar y dióxido de carbono. Sin embargo, desde la revolución industrial hemos visto un incremento de los gases de efecto invernadero y esto trae consigo un gran número de consecuencias extremas en el océano que también va a determinar la creación de otro tipo de fenómenos meteorológicos más peligrosos. Now, let's continue with our practice. We're going to witness what is happening to some species as a consequence of the increase in acidity levels. For this exercise, we will need water, 2 jars or glass containers, white vinegar, and beach shells or sidewalk chalk. Here are the instructions. Number 1, place some of the shells or chalk in a jar full of water. Number 2, place the rest of the shells in the other jar, but this time full of vinegar. Number 3, for this experiment, we will need several days to notice any changes. Now is the time to create a hypothesis about what you think is going to happen to the 2 jars. And number 4, at the end of 5 days, get them out of the jars and write down any changes. Here are the questions to answer. What do you think is going to happen to the jars and the shells inside the jars? What is the phenomena affecting the chemistry of the shells called? What changes have you observed? Based on this experiment and today's lesson, extrapolate these results to what's happening in our oceans and what the consequences could be and how we could reduce our impact on the environment. Thank you so much for watching again. We will follow this video with the 3rd video for our Environmental Sciences course in IEI High School next week. Thank you y hasta luego.